It's been a little while since we've done an SRD video, so let's get all charged up and jump into one today. Hello and welcome to Hessens County. I'm glad that you could join us again here today for another TTRPG talk. This video series discusses tabletop role-playing games, related materials, world building, suggestions, and game design. Today's video will be the next entry in our SRD or System Reference Document series. It has been a little while since we've done one of these, so let's just quickly summarize. An SRD is a framework of rules and mechanics that you could use to create your own game. SRDs also will sometimes include notes or suggestions for creators, promotional materials like logos to indicate compatibility with other games, and licensed languages that allow you to utilize the rules language specifically found in the SRD verbatim, instead of needing to just utilize the ideas and basic mechanics for your own games. Today's SRD, as I described, has all of the above because we will be discussing the Charge SRD by René-Pier Deshaies, the prolific creator behind TTRPG. In fact, we have actually already discussed an SRD created by RP, which you can find in our video on Hopes and Dreams. That will be linked up in the info bar or down in the description. I feel that the Charge system is best described as RP's blending of John Harper's Blades in the Dark and Fate from Evil Hat games. It also has some elements that may be familiar to people who have played games by Modifius that use their 2d20 system. Before we go into the mechanics and the like, I do want to elaborate a bit on what I said earlier about what all else this SRD offers. Charge is licensed for people to use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license, as you can see here. It also comes with logos like the one next to me that you are allowed to use to mark your game as powered by Charged. This helps indicate your game's compatibility with the rest of the Charged family of games. Besides being able to get the SRD from itch, it is also on the TTRPG website, as you can see here, in English, French, Spanish, or Italian. The same is true of Dash. Dash is sort of like the little sibling to Charge. If Charge was Fate Core, then Dash is Fate Condensed. In addition to some somewhat more streamlined mechanics, the Dash SRD is also missing a lot of RP's suggestions and extras that have been developed by the community at large. Some of these have been integrated into the PDF, which is what we were originally looking at here. But many of the other ones are actually still only found on the website, listed here under the extras. Now it's time that we dived a bit into those mechanics that Charge offers, and to help us with, we'll be taking a look at this compatible with Charge interactive character spreadsheet that was created by the itch user Pyreflies. Which is actually this one right here. This is actually a really nice and convenient pre-made. This is created for the Charge RPG, which is sort of the generic RPG that René-Pier created and then obviously made the SRD out of. But it has, as you can see, a number of the descriptions of many of the different mechanics that we'll be kind of hopping into. So just to kind of start, this game is built around building pools of 6-sided dice. The highest die rolled determines the success of any actions. Specifically, rolling between a 1 and a 3 is always a bad outcome of some sort. A 4 and a 5 are a partial success or a success with consequences, as some other systems would describe it. And rolling a 6 would, of course, be a full success. Rolling multiple 6s in your pool is considered gaining a critical success, in which case you'll get some sort of additional advantage of some sort. If your character is attempting an action using a single roll, a single die in your roll, as we just described, you would not be achieving full success very often because, of course, you have a 1 in 6 chance. However, you very rarely will you ever be rolling only one die. These extra dice come from various character mechanics that we're going to discuss in just a moment, but there are also several other tools that can influence the balance of play, or you can also gain extra dice from characters assisting you, which we'll discuss in just a moment. When it comes to the character themselves, as you can see on the screen here, whenever you are creating a character, one thing that you will do is you will need to put some points into the actions that you can see there in the box. The standard Charge has 12 different actions. Basically, these are kind of like how attributes might work in other games, where basically you put certain points, and the number of points, then if you're using that action to do something, then you would roll that many dice. One other thing that does also add to this is as your character promotes or advances, you gain talents. So it's generally encouraged that if you are creating a charge game, that you basically create playbooks. This is, of course, very similar to a lot of other games that you have probably seen, including, of course, Blades in the Dark, where basically there is a set number of things that this character is good at. It's not necessarily suggested, at least as far as I can tell in the playbooks, that you have to like set a certain action points, or maybe, you make suggestions as to a couple of different layouts of actions. The big thing, though, is when it comes to the talents, because again, this is essentially an upgrade tree. Basically, whenever you get an upgrade, you then pick one of these, or you go down the tree, basically. Where you gain, so for example, here on this first one, you could gain an action dot. So if I started with 2, maybe I gain a third one, right? Here we get a +1 effect when we're doing a certain type of action, and effects we'll discuss in a moment. Again, here we gain an extra die to our pool whenever we're doing a certain type of action in a certain situation. Like, for example, if let's say this is a stereotypical cleric character, let's say, then maybe I am gaining some plus D6 whenever I'm dealing with religious things, or I'm having some sort of religious discussion, right? Or counseling people. Obviously, those are not necessarily specific actions, but they are things where my knowledge or my experience could potentially shape the way that my character interacts with this particular situation that goes beyond the actual action pools that could contribute to that. So, going back to rolling dice, whenever an action roll is called, the GM will also get to determine the risks of the action and the strength of the effect that action will have based on what's come before, basically based on the narrative up to this point. These are both rated on a 3-point scale that mainly determine, again, this is primarily determining the narrative outcome of the roll, basically shaping how the consequences might occur, the level of extremity of those consequences, or if your character is successful, how successful are they? How big is the impact of their action? And that's when we were discussing effect. So, if we gain a +1 effect when I am utilizing my strength, right? Or maybe I gain a +1 effect when I am creating something, or when I'm fixing something, repairing something, something along those lines. That would mean that, whenever I am attempting to do something, then I am that much more likely to have a larger effect on it. So basically, it would bump me up a little bit up the tree. Now, normally you start at the base level of both effect and risk are like in the medium, so they're like moderate. So basically, the effect would be exactly but you're attempting or what you would expect, and the risk would be, there will be some sort of moderate consequence to potentially failing at this particular thing, and then it can go up or down, depending upon what's going on. As I mentioned earlier, several tools can influence the flow of play outside of character mechanics whenever we are talking about a charge game. And that, in part, is this section right here, which is labeled momentum. This is going to be relatively similar to those of you who've played Modifius 2D20 games, which is why I mentioned it earlier. This momentum can be used to add extra dice to a roll, provide help to an ally, or increase the effect of rating of an action, or as it mentions here, you could also potentially use it if you decide to integrate this particular rule into your game into flashback scenes, which are very similar to flashback scenes in Forged in the Dark games. So those are various different things that you can spend momentum on, but how do I get more? Well, your character has a chance of generating momentum every single time that you roll. Specifically, you gain 1 point every time you roll a partial success, 2 points of momentum for full successes, and 3 points of momentum whenever you get a critical success. The only exception to this would be if you already was spending momentum on this current roll. So this prevents the momentum cascades that I typically find plague the 2D20 momentum system, or at least the momentum mechanic in 2D20 systems. So this would prevent players from spending momentum to then gain further momentum. And any of you who might have watched any let's play live plays or anything like that of the Star Trek Adventures game will know exactly what I'm talking about, where your characters will just suddenly build up so much momentum that they're hitting their cap. Here, there doesn't really seem to be a cap, at least not in the standard system, but of course you're a lot more limited in when you can gain it, because again, you can only gain when you're not spending. Two other options that players have to influence the narrative is adding tension and determination rolls. Adding tension is a tool where the player could ask the GM to provide a trade, some sort of consequence for an additional die added to their current action roll, which of course this means that you can then, it gives you a means of adding dice to your roll without having to have momentum to spend on it. Now, keep in mind, this is not a guaranteed thing. The GM can decide basically that the situation does not really provide an opportunity for additional tension, maybe because there's just no tension already, or because adding tension wouldn't really help things, nor would it really help the player. Also, the player is allowed to turn down the trade once the GM has proposed the consequence. So basically, the player says, can we add some tension to this situation? The GM will decide, okay, we'll add situation by doing X. Player says, okay, that sounds good to me, and adds the extra die to their roll, or says, no, I don't really like that. I think I'll just go as is. So here's an example of a way that I might apply adding tension as a GM. Let's say a character in my game needs to create a tool to break into a safe. If the player asks me, the GM, to add tension, then I could offer that, let's say the tool you're creating is very distinct. Therefore, it's going to leave behind a detectable trace that is, again, also very distinct. This, of course, is potentially increasing the tension because this trace or mark or whatever it's going to leave behind is going to potentially act as a calling card. That would, of course, make it easier for the police to connect the crime to the tool, and therefore, by extension, make it more likely that the character will get found out in the future. So I'm increasing the risk of the situation should it not be successful, potentially. Determination rolls, meanwhile, are used in an attempt to resist a consequence. This could be one impacting your character or another character. This would not be a consequence like one adding the tension, but let's say if you got like a partial success. This operates very similar to an action roll because your dice roll is essentially the same. However, typically instead of, at least in base charge, you're not going to be using your character stats to resist. Instead, you're just going to be spending a point of momentum for each die that you add to this roll. The roll ranges, again, as I mentioned, are the same as the action roll. So your degrees are failing to reduce the consequence. Succeeding to at least reduce the consequence would be a partial success. Negating the consequence entirely would be a full success. And in the case of critical success, you would also then reduce the risk of a future roll. One other thing that Charges relies on pretty heavily when it comes to trying to determine exactly, like, when do certain things happen, when do we, win the game, or whatever you want to phrase that. How do we beat the opponent, solve the problem, whatever. Again, it suggests very heavily on using clocks. And again, those kind of tie back into the effects. So you could use, of course, progress clocks or danger clocks. Or you could basically combine those together in a way where you can have like a push-pull thing, where obviously progress moves it towards you, danger moves it towards your opponent, that kind of stuff. Where basically you have the limited, standard, and great effects, or the high, moderate, and low risks, basically ticking the clock's certain numbers of ticks. And again, you could have... Here, René-Pier suggests clocks of 4, 6, or 8 tech segments. Obviously, sometimes you might want to have more. But yeah, it's definitely something that could potentially help drive the narrative and the situation. And again, these are things also that you could use very easily, especially if your players are going totally off the rails and you need to throw in something quick. PCs will typically experience stress as one of the potential consequences to an action. Once your character has gained enough stress, they will then gain a condition. These conditions, of course, will then make it more difficult to do certain things. Also, filling up your character's stress clock, which in standard Charge only has 4 ticks in it, will also result in being taken out of the scene. Basically, your stress gets cleared, you're taken out, you gain a potential consequence or a condition, rather, that limits things that you can and cannot do moving forward until you do something to remove that condition, like whether that's a distinct injury or something along those lines. Another thing that you might want to potentially utilize is, at least when it comes to certain things, maybe there are certain other types of health you might need. So this particular type of stress and health is real more focused on combat, right? But of course, you can also deal in forms of competition and combat that are not physical, whether that's social or mental. So maybe there's some other form of health tracker that you could utilize, like an expendable resource that you're just utilizing, whether that involves using a clock or just like a large tracker, like a communal tracker. That's totally up to whatever specifically it is you're attempting to track, of course. And of course, you can't discuss things like stress or conditions without, of course, discussing some form of recovery. So yeah, basically, typical recovery. This is similar to reducing stress in Forge in the Dark games, where you have some sort of rest period where you're laying low, or you're actively seeking out some sort of help or assistance. You actually take a break, let's say, and then you regain that stress depending upon the specific action. Of course, for some Blades in the Dark for some Forge in the Dark games, that specific how much you gain back depends, or Powered by the Apocalypse games, how much you gain back depends specifically on like a roll that you do, or the specific action that you're doing. Or of course, you could just play it based on the narrative and what specifically it is you're doing and how cathartic that would potentially be for your character. And again, as I mentioned, obviously that will potentially remove certain conditions. Like, let's say my character had a broken leg, right? That obviously is going to take a while. But like a more minor injury like a sprain or something like that would of course be much simpler and easier to deal with. Two final things that I did want to go ahead and mention is that your player will sometimes want to spend some momentum in order to create a flashback scene. This again is very similar to the way that flashback scenes work in Forged in the Dark games, where you can't really undo what's already been established, but you can potentially insert something by saying, oh, well, my character got ready for this by doing X, right? Or my character packed this thing that they thought they might need because, and then give an explanation as to why their character originally thought that, or maybe somebody if I gave it to them or suggested something, or like, our character was in a bar and we meet somebody who really wants a drink, and I'll just say, oh, well, in a flashback scene, my character had picked it up. All right. Now, these could be things. This could, if it's something simple like, I happened to pick up a drink before we walked out of the inn. That's completely, that might be something that's not even worth spending momentum on. But obviously something that could potentially impact a future role, that's something that could probably require some spending of momentum. Then depending upon the narrative, the character's actions, how much momentum needs to get spent on it, the impact that this would have on the narrative, then the GM would need to decide if the character doesn't need to roll anything and everything's going to be fine, that the character would need to be successful in an action roll of some sort to determine exactly whether what the impact of the narrative setup here is going to be, or if it's more a matter of luck or talent, or really dependent on the actions of another character, an NPC, rather than the player's character themselves, then instead you might need to do a fortune roll, which this is something to just allow the GM basically to determine what's going to happen without necessarily having to touch anything. So basically, the more likely that they feel that this thing is going to happen, they're going to add 1d6 to the roll, and then it's basically exactly the same as an action roll. Finally, one last thing that René-Pier, of course, also includes some various descriptions of like the setting, what different ways that questions you might want to answer, different ways you might want to describe what the setting for your game is going to look like. And then, of course, also there's a section here talking about world forces. So these essentially are your factions or forces of nature or various things in the background that are kind of influencing the way that your game is going to play, depending on what time of game it is. Each of these things has a goal and a progress clock to see when they reach their goal. And of course, it is true that potentially actions of the players or actions of other factions or world forces around the players might make the ticking those clocks a little bit more difficult or easier. Again, either consequence as a result of the player's actions helping the force or working against the force. So that was the Charge SRD. Basically, it's essentially a system that is pretty useful for creating a wide number of different games. Again, Charge was originally created to be sort of a generic RPG, kind of along the lines of like the Basic Roleplaying game manual or the Fate Core book and stuff like that. Again, links to everything that's been described so far in the video will be found in the description down below. That, of course, includes links to Charge, both on the 40RPG website and also on itch. I'll also include a link to Dash on the 40RPG website, and a link to that Charge RPG character spreadsheet that we were taking a look at when we were describing how the characters generally work. Again, thank you all for joining us again here today on Hessens County for another episode of our SRD series. Don't forget to go out there and create games. Don't forget to rate your itch purchases, especially if you decide to grab the SRD or any of the wide number of games based off of it. And have a good zone.